And I should let you know that there may be more questions than Jan has time to answer tonight, and so I may occasionally combine some of them.
I'm grateful, and I'm thankful to all of you taking time out to join us tonight. So I'm to talk about Dreaming Me. And I have to tell you that when William taught his courses using Dreaming Me, I'm very grateful, William, that you used the earliest edition. There have been 5 editions of this book. And so I'm happy to tell you, William, you used the hardback, right? And this came out in 2001, and the paperback came out in 2002. And then in 2008, Wisdom Publication reissued it. And that's the first time it was called Dreaming Me, Black, Baptist, and Buddhist. You should know this. The first edition of it was called Dreaming Me, an African-American woman's spiritual journey. Yes. And then by the time 1 year later, it came out in paperback, the publisher had changed the subtitle. So then it was called Dreaming Me, From Baptist to Buddhist, One Woman's Spiritual Journey. I didn't like that, but they told me, you have rights over the subject, the main title only. Subtitles are our prerogative. So one day, talking with Wisdom, when they decided to bring it out again in 2008, I'm talking with Rod Meadsbury, and we're trying to come up with a different title, one that would encompass all of man. So we talked for a while, and then Rod goes away, and he walks down the hall, and you could hear him from the water fountain or the restroom yelling back. He said, "How about this? Dreaming Me, Black, Baptist, and Buddhist." And I thought, perfect, because I didn't want to say I was leaving my Baptist roots to find myself with Buddhism. I call myself a Baptist Buddhist in this book, not to be confused with Tina Turner, who calls herself a Buddhist Baptist. Okay. But the book's title, at least its subtitle, has gone through lots of changes. I'm happiest with Dreaming Me, Black, Baptist, and Buddhist. I think that gets the majority of who I am. Okay. So when William graciously agreed to lead a conversation, just last night, I sent him some photos. And then we agreed that maybe I should start with these images, little audio, little visual. Teachers. Okay. So William, if you're ready, could we start with these slides, please? If you look closely, you'll see several things. One, I'm pouting a little. Secondly, I look at this and I see I'm pretty well cared for. So I'm there with my ribbons and my bows. You can see it. The photo was taken in a studio, and I'm a little angry. So why? My father says because I didn't want to have my picture taken. But I think it might have had to do with what went before my picture was taken. And that is the straightening of the hair and the Shirley Temple curls. And the idea, even at age 4, I was resistant to the idea that I was supposed to look like Shirley Temple, that was the model of beauty. I took issue even at age 4. Why these things in my hair? And yet the ribbon, the bow, the lacy dress, the watch that was made of pearls, I can still see. I'm loved, and I know that too. Next slide, please, William. And Easter Sunday, William likes this picture, he's just told me. I show this picture because it says so much about the place I'm from, which was a mining camp named Docina, or Docina. I've learned since I became an adult that, it might have been the name of the 12th mine. This wasn't so much a town as a village. It was a village in the country, 7 miles outside of Birmingham. And This is an Easter Sunday. I'm around 9. I can see that dress, white with red polka dots, red socks, white shoes, again the bow, and again the Shirley Temple curl. But I show this photo to say several things about Docena, the mining camp. My family moved here when I was 2. So when I was a baby, we were city folk. But then we moved to what's called the country. Ha. And I loved it. I loved the forest that we were surrounded by. Whenever I was old enough and my mother would say, come on, let's learn how to cook something, I was out over the back fence, in the woods, in the pine trees. Loved it. But Docena had a real negative side too. As I said, it was a mining camp. And by the time I was this age, the mine had closed. Most of the people who lived in Docena worked in the coal mine. And as a result of that and the mines closing, most of the people, the families, the man was out of a job. Women were the housewives in those days. The men were out of jobs. The other thing about Docena is that it was a mining camp that was split down the middle between Blacks and whites. And so when you entered the camp of Docena, when you turned off the main road that took you from the city to the country, when you turned left into Docena, if you continued straight for 4 blocks, you would hit the white section of town. But if you turned left and went for 2 blocks and then immediately turned right, you entered the Black section of Docena. And so it was shaped sort of like an L, that is where Black people lived. This photo's taken on the corner of the L that heads towards the forest. So I'm looking back at our 3-room wooden house. And yes, just 3 rooms. And there's a road there, and then you see a tall tree behind my left shoulder. That tall tree was in my grandparents' backyard. So once my father moved to Docena, his parents moved to Docena from Inslee, Alabama, and then his brother moved, and his brother lived on the other side. So in this little L of the camp, there were 3 Willis families, and all 3 Willis families kept jobs in the steel mill in Inslee. So my father worked, his father worked, my uncle worked still in the steel mine. The other thing that this photo shows is the alleyway behind me. You see across that street in nope, same photo, the alleyway that's behind me. Several years later, when I was awarded several scholarships to go to northern schools, some Ivy League schools, the Klan area chief was amongst the whites who lived in Docena. So on the white side of Docena, there was this wizard of one sort or the other. And so whatever happened in the Black section of Docena, whites knew about. And they didn't care for it, typically, because when several years later, it was in our 4-page newspaper that the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Oram Willis has been awarded several scholarships to go to northern schools to college. The Klan came out and they marched against our family. So to make this sort of short, I talk about this in a chapter in Dreaming Me that's called Trouble Along the Cable. In that chapter, I say, when I was growing up, you could never see Black people on TV. You could hear them introduced, for example. We could hear Ed Sullivan introduce Sammy Davis Jr. But when that stiff-necked Ed turned to say, welcome everybody as to Sammy Davis, a placard would come and cover the screen of the TV, and it would say, with a man with baggy pants holding a pipe with star-like things shooting out of it, the caption would say, trouble along the cable. So whenever a Black person was to be on TV, and I know my editors wondered, they said, nobody will believe a story like this. how did people have control of the TV airwaves, Jan? We were never allowed to see Black faces on the TV. So it was a very circumscribed Jim Crow South. Yeah, to be sure, there were white and colored signs over the drinking fountains. If you could find a colored drinking fountain, then you could drink if you were a Black child. But otherwise, you'd better not. Tikaha. So when word got out several years from this photo that I had won several scholarships and was to be the first in my family to go to college, the Klan came out. And it just so happened, this will be the longest story, William. It just so happened that my father was working the graveyard shift at the steel mill, TCI steel mill. He was away. So there was my mother, my older sister, older by 2 years, and myself at home. We knew what was happening because it had happened before. If the Klan were making show of being unhappy with a Black family, they would go through the camp honking horns. So in the middle of the night, we heard these horns. We got up. My mother grabbed her .22 caliber pistol, pearl handle pistol, and stood at the door and told my sister and I to get down on the floor, get under the bed if you can. And I was frozen to the window because as those cars and trucks slowly came to a halt, they set up a cross just at the other edge of the road in that alley that you see behind me here. 12, 15-foot cross. It was a big cross, and they set it on fire. While my mother stood at the door, I was glued to the window and noticing this. First, I noticed that the robes were not all white. This is reflecting from the fire of the cross. That some of the robes were purple, satiny. Some of the robes were red. Some of the robes were white. And the second feature I noticed was that there were children in the group. There were children enrobed at this ritual they were having in front of our house. There were children. And what I wanted to do, though I was much too afraid, my tongue was numb. What I wanted to do then was to say to those folk, hate-filled, burning a cross, because someone in that house had gotten scholarships, I wanted to tell them that they were making a mistake, that we were a family inside this house, just like they were a family, that we were typically men, women, and children in this house, just as they were there. And so what I wanted was to teach them. It's one of my earliest strong memories of wanting to teach, was that they're making a mistake. We are human beings, just like them. Fortunately for us, that particular night, after burning the cross and saying some things that I call mumbo jumbo, they got back in their cars and trucks and drove away, honking. Next slide, please. That night, we were spared. Here's a much taller cross from a book on King. And at a grand ceremony, you would have something like this. Tens, even hundreds of Klansmen. And next slide, please. Klan women. Sometimes, as was the case in front of my house when I was going off to college, there would be Klan children too, all enrobed, all to make the point that one of us or some of us didn't apparently know our place. We were stepping out. We were going north. I doubt whether any of them cared that those schools were Ivy League. They cared that they were Yankee schools. So this was the world I grew up in, knowing that if you made a mistake, if you drank from the wrong fountain, if you crossed over too soon to the one place that we got mail in Docena, the commissary, which says Mercado outside. I think it must have been the 12th, the Spanish town had been founded to be a coal mine, that if you stepped out of, it could be dangerous. To be conspicuous as a Black person when I was growing up would have been quite dangerous. And it was even more dangerous, though that's probably, the comparison's probably wrong. But children, I'll say it this way, children when I was growing up came under attack. So when I entered school in 1954, Brown v. Board of Education, it meant that the Alabama State Supreme Court went into overdrive to make sure that the federal law was never implemented. The federal law that said we should integrate schools should never be implemented. And so I graduated from an all-Black county high school to which I was bused 7 miles every day, even though in Docena there was a perfectly good high school, but it was for whites only. 11 years after Brown v. Board of Education. And I'll just note, since there's a recent movie about it, but I'm sure plenty in the here amongst us knew about it. Emmett Till was the movie Till I saw the other night. And I thought, this is a wonderful young actress. That's what I thought. But there's Till. That was 1955. Children were under attack. Oh, we'll pick this thread up later. But there were women, men, and children in Klan outfits who disrupted parties in Docena that Black children were having. Too much racket, too much happiness. Klan. I grew up this way. Next slide, please. Oh, until 1963, when the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King decided that he would bring his civil rights movement to the most segregated city in the South. These are King's words. He called Birmingham, right? And he'd been in Mississippi before, and okay, he called Birmingham the most segregated city in the South. He decided to bring his civil rights movement there. And in April and May of 1963, we children got to march. The marches went on for five weeks. The last 5 or so days, it was meant to be 10 days, but after 5, the city council decided to negotiate. The Children's March, or the Children's, what is it sometimes called? The Children's Crusade. This is 1963. So some people have asked me, how come 1963? Well, it's like Baldwin, James Baldwin, saying in The Fire Next Time in his letter to his nephew, you and I both know that we're celebrating emancipation 100 years too soon. In other words, the Emancipation Proclamation having come out in 1863, and here it is 1963, and Black folk are still not free. It was one of those important signal years to have these demonstrations. So King thought not only in Birmingham, but he thought 1963, the conscience of this nation needs to be raised. It needs to be touched again. So King came to Birmingham, and with other ministers, the call went out, and we children were ecstatic. Next slide, please. Because it meant that for the first time, we could do something to help the cause. So Birmingham at the time, and this won't be too long, Birmingham at the time had a police commissioner named Eugene Bull Connor. And Connor decided that he would call on the police department as well as the Birmingham Fire Department, which you see on this, the back of this man's coat. He called them both out to break up the demonstrators, to dissuade us. Now, I showed you a picture from the Children's March. That was actually a group of days from May 1st to May 10th set aside when only children marched. But on other days, it was mainly children who marched because their parents worked. You know, you could be arrested or taken off and beaten up by the Klan if you were known to be a member of the NAACP in those days. I remember being in college and thinking, NAACP, what did it ever do? But it was dangerous at the time when I was growing up. Anyway, Bull Connor. So these are some famous pictures from the Birmingham campaign. This is earlier on, but these are some of these folk are children too. The Bull Connor decided they would use hoses and they would use, next slide, please. They would use dogs to break up these marches. And so I have to tell you now that we children, well, the staging point for all the marches were the churches downtown in Birmingham. There were 2 or 3 churches, but the main church, the main staging ground, was always the 16th Street Baptist Church. There's a reason that it's that church that comes around in September of 1963 to be bombed. And there's a reason that the time that the 4 Klansmen threw the bomb was at Sunday school, the time of Sunday school, because children, as I say, had been under attack and continued to be the focus of attacks. So now, famous photo. I think if you Google Birmingham marches, you'll see this photo. So they brought out the hoses and they brought out the dogs. The hoses, I remember being pinned against buildings by the hoses. I remember this photograph because on this day, my father and mother and sister and I were all marching together. Now we marched in 2s. So, but we were so close to this man, we could touch him. And I said once, much later, to my father, showing him this picture and some others, I said, Dad, we were right there. We were right there. But we're not in any of the photos taken. And my father chuckled a little. He chuckled a little. He says, well, daughter, always called me daughter. He said, well, daughter, you're right. We were right there. But then we weren't there to have our photos taken. He reminded me. This photo is famous for another reason. And that's because when these dogs were sicked on that man took out a pocket knife from his back pocket and he cut this dog's throat. And then you heard this from this growling, you heard this sort of, this little whelp and yelp, and then the dog, there's blood everywhere. So that was another traumatic thing. I was afraid of dogs for years, but the blood was pretty traumatic too. Now, so having cut the dog's throat, policemen came, more policemen than I had seen that whole day, came in on that man with billy clubs, and they just hit him wherever they could. So we say we're used to this now, but it was pretty startling. Every place they could hit him, they hit him. And then they took him off face down by his legs spread eagle, his arms spread eagle, face down, they carried him away. And I worried for years what happened to that man. And once I was in the Birmingham Civil Rights Museum, and I was talking about this photo, and I guess I said something out loud. So I looked at this woman to my right, and I said, I always wonder what happened to him. She said, that man's my uncle. That man's my uncle. They took him off. They beat him up real bad. They kept him about 30 days. We didn't know where he was. She said, but he's all right. They let him go after about a month. And I was thrilled. That set my heart at ease to know that man was still alive. He was okay, I mean, he had been beaten up, probably tortured, but he was okay. So that was really great to know. Now, the other thing I want to say, because I said I'm Black, Baptist, and Buddhist, right? I want to say that in order to march, we children had to learn something that was very, very important. We had to learn before we were allowed to march. We had to learn the discipline that goes along with nonviolence. So we didn't have cars in those days. The buses, the county school buses would come around, open their doors, toot their horns, and say, going downtown. All us kids would just, storm the buses and get on and ride downtown. It was the only way we could have gotten down. The buses took us to the steps of the 16th Street Baptist Church, and we all filed up the steps. This was the main staging. Now, what happened inside the church was that the church ladies, the elders, the matrons, screened us to see whether or not we were fit to march that day. And they could tell. So they would say, Janice, are you ready to march today? I said, yes, ma'am, I'm ready. I'm a little nervous, but I'm ready. Because truth was, I was scared to death, but every day, if you do something once and it works out, you go again, even if you're scared. So they would say, okay, then get over there in the line. And we lined up by twos, right? But so often I heard it be the case that young men, especially, these are teenagers we're talking about. I was 15. Children march from ages 7 through 18. Everybody that was normally in school went downtown to march. But if you said to one of those women, John, are you ready to march, young man? Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am, I'm ready. That woman was liable to say to you, no, John, no, I don't think you're ready today. Baby, you sit over there and you work on your Sunday school lesson. You're not marching today. And then they go on to the next person. I've seen it with my own eyes that those women did a good job of screening. Because if you marched in one of Dr. King's marches, you had better not lift a hand. You had better be willing to be nonviolent at the cost of your life, I want to say. We took pledges in addition to going through those women. We took pledges. If you look at Martin Luther King's Why We Can't Wait, for example, he gives you the pledges. He enumerates them. They started out being 6, and then they increased to 10. We had to sign a little paper, and the paper said, I hereby pledge myself, I'm reading now, I hereby pledge myself, my person and body, to the nonviolent movement. Therefore, I will keep the following 10 commandments. He was a preacher. 1, meditate daily on the teachings and life of Jesus. 2, remember always that the nonviolent movement in Birmingham seeks justice and reconciliation, not victory. 3, walk and talk in the manner of love, for God is love. 4, pray daily to be used by God in order that all men might be free. Ha! A little bit like Bodhisattvahood there. Anyway, 5, sacrifice personal wishes in order that all men might be free. 6, observe both friend and foe, towards both friend and foe, the ordinary rules of courtesy. 7, seek to perform regular service for others and for the world. 8, refrain from violence of fist, tongue, or heart. 9, strive to be in good spiritual and bodily health. 10, follow the directions of the movement and the captain of each demonstration. We signed it, we gave our address, we gave our parents' names. Then we went under scrutiny of the older women. And then we were allowed to march or not march. Next slide, please. So I show this picture to show that, unlike myself, this young man in Birmingham, when the dogs are sicked on him, I think if you look at this picture, you'll see that he does not attempt to block those dogs' mouth. He doesn't begin to lift his arm. In other words, he is what in Buddhism we would call a brave bodhisattva. He took those pledges to heart. nonviolence, the use of nonviolence was the strategy when Howard Thurman, who taught this to King, talked to Gandhi, met and talked with Gandhi in the 30s, late 30s. He said to Gandhi, is it true that nonviolence ought to be the main strategy? And Gandhi apparently immediately responded, it is the only strategy. Love it. More on nonviolence. But when I met nonviolence in Buddhism, it's not just interdependence. It's not just compassion and love. It's not just service to others. For me, it's always been this one little verse in the Dhammapada, Dhammapada 183, which I believe captures the whole of Buddhism. Dhammapada 183 says, do no harm. Practice what is good. Discipline the mind. This is the teaching of all the Buddhas. Do no harm. Practice virtue. Discipline the mind. This is the teaching of all the Buddhas. In other words, discipline, it takes discipline to do good in the world and relations with others. It takes nonviolence and love. It takes a heart grounded in that. It takes more than just a knee-jerk reaction, as King would say. It has to become a way of life. It has to become an attitude, not just something you manage to do on occasion. It has to become something like this young man, like it had become for him. Not even raise your arm to protect yourself. He was practicing nonviolence against Birmingham's dogs. And anyone who thinks we didn't win this struggle should just note that the next year, the Civil Rights Act was passed, Tikaha, and we children felt like we had won. Next slide, please. Many may know that that King and Thich Nhat Hanh became friends. They actually only met twice, but they corresponded with each other. And this is one of the pictures I like to show. It is from a press conference that King had along with Thich Nhat Hanh on April 4th, 1967, just before King delivers the anti-Vietnam War speech, which was one of his most developed and good speeches about the state of the United States and why we shouldn't be fighting on behalf of the US Vietnamese people. We should not be fighting. King said that there were three evils in the US society: hatred, greed, what did he call it? Racism, consumerism, and militarism. Hatred was militarism. Consumerism was greed, and ignorance was the feeling that we're separate from one another, the main ignorance that makes us feel closer to some and more distant from others. King, and it's true, at Boston College, King took some courses in Buddhism. I like finding those things out. So this was April 4th, 1967. King, just as he had taken a chance to have children march in Birmingham, for which he came under a lot of flack, was James Bevel's idea, but finally King went along with it. He came under lots of criticism. You're going too far, Martin. Don't have children out there. King said, make sure the press is there. Make sure the press is there. And then John F. Kennedy got involved. And then under Lyndon Johnson, the Civil Rights Act was passed. But I also show this photo because King was assassinated, not just for his nonviolent civil rights activities, but because he came out against the war. And that was all there was in those days. That's a big coming out against something. And thirdly, because he became it became clear that he wanted more than just laws changed. You know, King said famously, you might not be able to change a man's attitude, but you can change how he behaves with law. But then King said, we need more, just as we always did. We gained freedom, so-called, with the Emancipation Proclamation, but we didn't get any economic benefit out of it. We were never given 40 acres and a mule, for example, which might have helped a little bit, even things out. But we weren't, so we didn't get that. So King started saying, all labor has dignity, which meant that he was going with labor unions. That was a threat to the US government as well. Next slide, please. I think it's too many slides now, I think. Okay. Oh, so I want to say this. Just because this is a little bit of history you may not know. And when I found out recently, I was thrilled. So King was, I think, the right man for the time. He also had as his personal mentor, spiritual mentor, a man named Howard Thurman. Howard Thurman taught Pauli Murray, Martin Luther King, Bayard Rustin, Jan Willis, all the ones we know about. He taught them a way to meditate, to pray, and to meditate. It was a practice that Howard Thurman taught. So when we see, so this picture is from one of the walks towards the Pettus Bridge. I hear myself speed it up. Let me just say, there were actually 3 attempts to cross the Pettus Bridge. The first we know of as Bloody Sunday. That was when King was still in Atlanta and John Lewis was marching with some others. And the police on horseback started into the crowd and beat up a number of people, and John Lewis suffered greatly. And so it was known as Bloody Sunday. The Black protesters were gonna march. And this is all nonviolent ways of making your case, right? They were gonna march from Selma to Montgomery. Well, that march was unsuccessful, Bloody Sunday. King then flew to Selma and said, I'll take the march next week. Okay. And people have wondered about this historically. They start out, King and several hundred people. But before they get too far, after they've knelt down, the second time, the march, the King stands up from kneeling, turns to the crowd and says, not today. Everybody turn around. We're not going to try today. That was the second march. I love it. Because the next week they went. Now, in the meantime, they went, and the third march was successful. King gave this famous speech from the steps of the Montgomery courthouse. How long? Not long, right? But the second time, I think, indicates more than symbolically praying. And I don't mean it to sound like I'm making less of it. They weren't just praying. They were practicing what Howard Thurman calls listening, a kind of meditation in which you're counseled to get rid of distraction and take yourself apart for solitude, and then practice deep silence, and then a practice of what Thurman calls centering down through the heart, what we might call the heart chakra, and then listening. So we might know this from certain biblical accounts. How does the voice of God come? Does it come in a whirlwind? Does it come in a fiery storm? Does it come in the flood? No, it comes how? In a still small voice. In a still small voice. And Howard Thurman gave his followers a technique for listening for that voice. So I'm suggesting that this photo and perhaps the next one taken on, could we see the next one, please, William? Yes. And this one, after which King says, no, we're going to turn around, not today. He was practicing listening, and he heard a voice of the spirit tell him not today. He came under criticism for that from people inside the movement. What happened? Did he lose his nerve? People talked about that for a hot week. Was King giving up? No. Third time they marched all the way and he gave this great speech. Next slide, please. When King died, it was 2 days after he first went to join these labor folk, the sanitation workers in Memphis, who carried signs that I was reminded of in the wake of George Floyd, in the wake of even earlier on, the Black Lives Matter movement began when people carried signs which stated the obvious. I had to state them because America had not been treating us that way. So during the Memphis protests, the sanitation workers carried signs saying, I am a man. Why? Because their whole lives, no matter how old they were, they had been called boy. If they lived in the segregated South, they were called boy. So the sign states the obvious. I am a man. This is what the sanitation workers carried. I am a man, doggone it. Call me by my right name. Again, for me, I wonder how many times do we go through this? Because the Black Lives Matter movement, we had similar signs stating the obvious, Black Lives Matter. And we wouldn't need to state the obvious were it obvious to most of America. But when it seems not obvious, we have to state the obvious. Next slide, please. This is James Lawson, who I haven't mentioned, but some of you may know James Lawson, who taught at the University of California at LA, courses on nonviolence. And Michael Honey last year came out with a book of some of James Lawson's lectures. The book is called Revolutionary Nonviolence, Organizing for Freedom. And James Lawson taught Jan Willis and Martin Luther King, having met James Lawson at a talk when King was giving a talk at Oberlin. James Lawson came to listen to him, and they got to have lunch. They had lunch before him. And when they talked, Martin Luther King said to James Lawson, who had been a conscientious objector, who had spent 3 years in prison for not going to the war, who had gone to India to study Gandhian principles. King said to him, you know what we need in the South. We need a disciplined way of instituting nonviolence. And Lawson agreed to move to Knoxville, Tennessee, where he led a group of students from FIS, one named Diane Nash, the other named Jan Willis, in training, and then those two and a number of others. He trained the sit-in, those folk who sat in at the counters and desegregated Nashville, Tennessee's business establishments. James Lawson knows how to use nonviolence strategies in a revolutionary, freedom-seeing way. So King said, James Lawson, come teach us how to do it. Lawson taught this group. Then the group of freedom riders asked the people in Nashville to teach them how to do it. I'm just saying, nonviolence has to be a discipline. It has to be a discipline. It's not just something you say, okay, I'm going to go out here and march with these people, and I'm going to be nonviolent. It takes training. Okay, I think there may be 3 or 4 slides, so let's just go through them quickly, William, and then I'll stop talking. Here's Howard Thurman. Okay, he was dean at Howard. he knew Martin Luther King's father, and so he was often at their home in Atlanta as Martin was growing up. Their old Morehouse buddies, Howard Thurman and King's father. So he was around the house. And Martin knew him from the time he was 5 or 6. And Howard Thurman wrote this book called Jesus and the Disinherited. He wrote 30 books, but one of the most well-known one is Jesus of the Disinherited. He says, I practice not the religion of Christianity, I practice the religion of Jesus. And that's the religion he taught. And he taught he led a multiracial church in San Francisco, multiracial, multi-ethnic, world religious. He taught them what? How to meditate and how to listen. Called himself an ordinary mystic who was mentor to nonviolent movements, especially nonviolent civil rights movements in the States. Howard Thurman, good man. And quickly, next couple. So George Floyd, we all know, I don't mean to rush through, in 2020. And then what we had known as Black Lives Matter movement got rekindled again. Because why? Because all of us, if we were fortunate enough to be in lockdown in our homes rather than being essential workers who soon became our dispensable workers, we know who they were, the people who didn't have the privilege of staying in and ordering out and ordering in. The Black Lives Matter movement rekindled because we all watched for 9 minutes and 46 seconds as those policemen lynched or killed or took the breath away from George Floyd, that gentle giant, George Floyd. Yes, so that movement got rekindled. The obvious signs came out again. But unlike in the 60s, when there were mostly, though there were some whites, where there were mostly Black people by the hundreds, the rekindled George Floyd Black Lives Matter movement involved millions of people, hundreds of millions around the world, because we all were made complicit with that. We all saw it. We couldn't turn away. It was played over and over and over again. Man's inhumanity towards man, and centered right in front of our eyes. That race is at the heart of the paradox that is America. And you have a second paper that was distributed to you that I wrote, little paper that's called What America, What It Might Be, What We Might Become. Okay, next slide, please. A composite of Black Lives Matter, men's names killed at the hands of the police, and women's names who were neglected at the beginning. It was because 3 Black women who, great women founded this movement, but it focused on the men. And then some women said, wait, women suffer at the hands of police brutality too. Women like Sandra Bland, people like 93-year-olds and 7-year-olds also died at the hands of police brutality. So this is a composite sign. Say their names, women and men's names. Next slide, please. I think it's my, yeah, okay. So I met His Holiness in 1972 in Switzerland. Here's Jan Willis meeting His Holiness while His Holiness was visiting DC, I think. Tikaha, next slide. Tikaha, Barack Obama met His Holiness when His Holiness visited DC. You can see Obama was younger then, when he was a senator. He says, however, in some accounts, that he carried that kata. There's the exchange of katas, how you greet a Tibetan and Tibetan greets you. So that His Holiness gave the kata back to him, and that's what he's wearing there. And it's said in some accounts that he kept, during his inauguration, he carried that kata from His Holiness in his inside pocket. I thought, that's sweet. Made an impression on him. Oh, next slide, please. Yeah, so my teacher again. This was the composite of slides. This is 1974, the first time my teacher Lama Yeshe came to, this is an old picture, obviously, came to Madison, Wisconsin, and I'm with him, and I had more hair then. Next slide, please. Oh, and this graphic was made for an article I wrote. And the people told me who did the graphic, they said, you can use it whenever you want. We like it too. And this slide is called The Buddha Was an Activist. And I believe that if the Buddha were alive today, the Buddha would certainly be on the side of those carrying those signs. He would have a sign himself saying, yes, Black Lives Matter. Tikaha. I don't know how long I've been. I heard myself racing at the end. Okay. Now we can, thank you so much for your attention. I hope some of this was clear and I didn't rush through it too fast. I'd like us to take a breath. Oh, center down. I think across meditative traditions, this is done. We center down. This is Howard Thurman's words. We take a deep breath. We just see. Yeah. So let's see how long I've been talking. We should see whether or not, William, you'd like to start with some questions, or we should ask the participants if we should go to them first. 19 people in the chat. I am happy to take your questions, either yours, Williams, or those from the audience. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you, Jan. And maybe we are a small enough group that people could ask their own questions, and maybe I'll call on folks. And the invitation is to be succinct in posing the question. So we want to give Jan as much time to be speaking as we can. So Nisa, and then Chris, I see you also. So go ahead, Nisa. Oh.
Mute, you're muted.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Oh,
I am in a Starbucks with my headphones. So is there background music that's disruptive?
No, we can hear you well.
Okay, good. Thank you. Yeah, so first of all, I just want to say another name that has impacted me. There was a classical pianist. I'm a classical musician myself. I play viola, and I had encountered somebody during my studies who was a Black pianist, and unfortunately in 2022 he lived in Indianapolis, and his parents called 911. He was having an episode of psychosis, and police went into his home, and 15 minutes later he was dead. And there was body cam footage released of unedited of what happened, and this is just another person, so I just want to say his name, Herman Whitfield III. There's information online about that, and it really hurts me. He was a classical musician trained at a conservatory at Oberlin in Ohio, and I encountered him. I saw him. I think I saw him perform. I remember seeing him on campus. This happened. So just another name that I want to say.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. It really hurts. And I have a question. So in terms of like safety of kind of artistic communities, folks, I'll just be direct. I'm possibly being offered a position as a therapist, working with artists and musicians as a therapist at a Midwestern university, and I'm wondering, like, given our political climate currently that is hostile towards universities increasingly, also towards communities of color, also just artistic folks, what is your recommendation? Like, how can, what is the safety that it lays ahead, for Black communities in kind of, it like where you were in the South, for example, or in the Midwest? If there's any insight you could provide and so forth.
Thank you. Thank you, Nita.
Thank you. Yeah.
Well, thank you for mentioning Herman Whitfield Jr.'s name. Appreciate that.
Sorry, it's Herman Whitfield the third.
The third. Not Junior. The third.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I sometimes have, so two responses. I sometimes have people do metta meditations. And before we do metta meditations, we say the names, just whoever wants to say, from a whole list of names that we could have, someone say a name. And, we have a cacophony of names, and we can't be about to name them all. More than 1,000 a year, and police don't have to report homicides caused that it's not a law that they have to take a. So sometimes it's good to do metta meditations, because metta meditations begin, may you be free from danger. And even though these are people that we know have passed on, we know that their last moments might have been moments of terror, and they were under attack. So the one way to think of them is to think of them and to wish those 4 wishes. May you be free from danger. May you now be free from danger. May you know the ease of physical well-being and of mental well-being and the ease of well-being. Those can become such genuine wishes for all those people whose names we can call. And then the second answer requires me to be more specific than I'm able to be. What I would say is, act out of love, whatever you do. Make sure that's the center, so that you don't act with hatred. But acting with love will give you power to go further. And meditate. I'm just saying this. I'm not like a teacher saying, yeah, this is how you have to, I'm saying,
Yeah, definitely.
Yes, to the extent that we're able. If we use our meditation to be calm and clear about something, then our creativity has a chance to bubble up. And so I think we'll find answers that we hadn't conceived of yesterday by using our practice. That's what I mean. It sounds really general, but by using our practice, we can come up, that's what I meant in this article, come up with creative ways of addressing today's issues and concerns. We know there's a lot of suffering out there, and we don't want to get overwhelmed by it. But I think if we use our meditation to be creative about it, we come up with creative solutions. Not solutions that'll just, the environment will be safe here on out, right? But whatever we can do where we are, let's use our meditations to gain clarity on that. And then to put that clear-sighted wish into action with love.
Thank you.
It's my pleasure.
Chris?
So Jan Willis, I just wanted to praise and thank you so much. I had the privilege of teaching engaged Buddhism at Harvard for 20 years, and I had the privilege of teaching His Holiness the Dalai Lama and Thich Nhat Hanh and Dr. B.R. Ambedkar and Bernie Glassman and Jan Willis. And Dreaming Me was on the required reading for so many years, and the students so responded to your story and to your life. And women students, students of color, students who knew of oppression in various parts of the world. It was just such a special book. And I just want to mention that toward the end, there's such a great passage. There's so many passages, but you're talking about Pastor Porter, Reverend Porter in your Baptist church back home, and how he talked about the, he said Second Thessalonians, but your father corrected him, whispered in your ear and said, no, it's really First Thessalonians, and the practice of being grateful for all of our blessings. And that you've carried that throughout your life, no matter what the adversities, to be grateful and count your blessings. And this was also, you connected to this to 1 Kings 19, the still small voice that Elijah heard, not in the whirlwind and not in the earthquake, but God speaking quietly. And that's what King was hearing, I think, in that second Pettus March.
Absolutely.
And you just showed us that slide,
Absolutely.
the still small voice, and you talk about that in your book. And you also then go on to connect it with Shantideva, talking about forbearance and love. And so this is so typical of your book as the Buddhist Baptist or Baptist Buddhist. And it's just, if any of you have not read Dreaming Me, you must go out and order it from Amazon or whatever, get a copy right away and read this marvelous book. I just wanted to say a little note about Howard Thurman as well. I hadn't realized until your talk that Martin King knew him as a child, but he ran into him again at Boston University when King was getting his doctorate at Boston University, because Thurman was the first Black chaplain of a major white university, previously a Methodist university in the North. And of course, they had a lot of connection there too. And Thurman brought Gandhi's nonviolence to the US and so on, and King picked that up. But I would just like to say that if you want to read more, any of you want to read more about Howard Thurman, this mystic, his autobiography is titled With Head and Heart, and it is a most powerful book. From a child, he heard God speak to him through the ocean down in Florida where he grew up and so on. But Jan, you brought so many of these things together for us in this talk, and I thank William and Barry Center for Buddhist Studies for making this evening possible. So thank you so much.
I am so glad you're part of the audience. It's so good to see you, Chris. It's really wonderful. Last time I think might have been 2010 when Bernie was putting on the nose for us, and we were at the Engaged Buddhism conference at the farm. So
that's right. That was the symposium that we had for socially engaged Buddhism, and you were a featured speaker there.
Well, it was great. It was great to see you then. It's great to see you now. I want to tell you about a friend's newest book on Howard Thurman. Came out February this year. Am I right? She was a student of mine. Her name is Lerita, Lerita Coleman Brown. Her book is called What Makes You Come Alive? After one of Howard Thurman's most famous quotes, Howard Thurman said to people, don't ask what the world needs you to do. Ask what makes you come alive. Because what the world needs, in his mystical way, what the world needs is for you to come alive. So she's named her book, What Makes You Come Alive, A Spiritual Walk with Howard Thurman. She's a Black woman, lives here in Stone Mountain, Georgia. This is a wonderful book. I called her up and I said, Lerita, you're talking about his method of meditation. I got it now. I mean, he's written books called Meditations of the Heart. But she talks about the method, and it's really a great read. Just new on Amazon, doing well. What Makes You Come Alive? A Spiritual Walk with Howard Thurman. I highly recommend it, together with what Chris has just told us about. Thank you.
Can you repeat her second last name? Lerita Thurman.
Lerita Coleman Brown.
Brown. Thank you.
Good read.
So Randy and Sharon, I see your hands are up, and also in response to some of the comments and questions that I've been getting, I just want to pose a question.
Thank
for
you so
Jan,
much,
and then
Chris.
we'll get back to people speaking their own questions. Jan,
Yeah.
in the book, you talk about some of the ways in which Tantra offers possibilities for healing from some of the deep wounds of living as part of a subordinated group in a hierarchical society, wounds that you experienced as a woman, as a Black woman growing up in the United States. Can you say a little bit about what you learned from Lama Yeshe that helped you in your healing?
Thank you so much for asking that. I say to this day, and I really count it as true, that, well, Lama Yeshe gave me everything. I know he continues to bless me, even though he passed away in 1986. And what he did was he gave me confidence. He let me know about Buddha nature and told me I had it too. Because when I first met Lama Yeshe, I was dragging all this baggage of having been told pretty much all my life. When I wasn't with my immediate family or my immediate church, baptism was a great thing. Joining that community was great. But otherwise, everybody else in the world, everybody who was white in my world growing up, was telling me that I was worthless, that I was dumb. Here you have it, folks. If you are born in America and you're Black, I know many of you, I don't have to tell this, you have maybe a hard time thinking that you're resplendent and you have dignity and you have what in the Tibetan tradition is called divine pride. It's not egotistic pride, but it's dignity. You know, it's like feeling really from your heart that you're quite okay. I wouldn't have had that feeling, I don't believe, had I not met Lama Yeshe, who told me every day in every way I was quite okay, quite smart, oh, like this, and repeated it for the 15 years I knew him. I think that if I had to describe what his main teaching to me was, it was that he built my confidence. He made that a priority. And I'll tell you a story about it. Once I was talking with Lama Yeshe with a group of other Westerners. We were just having a conversation. And all of a sudden, Lama Yeshe did this. And I said, you know, looking confused, what does that mean, Lama? And he said to me, there's other people there. He said, I say one thing, you see five. But with the baggage I was carrying, I immediately said, well, is that bad, Lama? Because I thought it must be bad. It was always bad, right? He said, no, silly, it means you're quick. Your mind is quick. So whenever, on numerous occasions thereafter, we could be walking down Kathmandu in Tamil, buying an ice cream or something, different group of people. If Lama Yeshe was there, at some point in the conversation, whether he was walking ahead and his hands were behind him, he would give that signal. Just show it. Just show it to me. It wasn't meant for anybody else. He would just do it to me. Just a soft, tender love and confidence. You know, like you made a good point. Just every now and then, you know, show me 5 fingers. So that was part of a method, okay, for telling me I was okay. And the other thing was giving me practices and believing I could do them, you know, and blessing me so that I could. So, you know, a teacher does a lot for you. One of the things, Lama Yeshe has written a book called Introduction to Tantra. And it's one of the most, I think, accessible, easy, really easy to comprehend, and most profound books on how Tantra works. how Tibetan Vajrayana practice works. You know, it's called secretive, right? Oh, and here's how it works. Broad strokes. It works by taking the end as the means. It says, you want to become Buddha? Then become Buddha right now, which means take on the responsibility of acting, thinking, speaking like a Buddha would. Okay? But without pride and without pretense. It's tough. I mean, it might sound easy, but and it says, the tantric theory says, we as human beings spend so much time entertaining negative thoughts about ourselves, entertaining negative machinations about ourselves, you know, having regrets, anticipating the future. We're never in the present moment because the present might show us some negative thing we don't like about ourselves. So Tantric Buddhism says we spend our time engaged in negative images of ourselves. Let's switch those images to divine ones. So it says, use your ability to visualize and visualize yourself as a deity. This is divine pride. As a deity. And there, you know, Kala Chakra Tantra has 722 deities. There are a lot of them. It's like a medicine chest. Sometimes I tell my students who say, yeah, I'm sort of becoming forgetful. And I go, you know, I'm a lot older than you. Forgetful, tell me. All right, but there are deities which symbolize, if you will, intelligence. Oh, so there's Manjushri, symbolizes wisdom. There's Green Tara, you probably can't see her here, symbolizes long life and capability, that you can do things, you can accomplish things. So you spend your time, some of your time, visualizing yourself in other ways, in ways not typical for you. And more you try to live from that as image. So you just switch that negative energy for a positive one and live through that. Not pretending. So you need a teacher to know, otherwise your ego grows and you dig the hole deeper into samsara. But someone who can help you to bring out, indeed, the positive qualities you already possess. That's the method of Tantra. It says you're already a Buddha. You have to show that. You have to manifest that. Not the doom and gloom and unworthiness, but this other part of you, this deeper part of you. Emanate that. But then you need to be shown how, and do these things. And then you need to have a good teacher to help you to do that. And I was blessed with a teacher who just loved me up and told me I was okay. And at some point it started to take, that's all. But it started to take. And I was so glad about it. Oh, so William, I hope that addressed some of the things you were asking about.
Yes, that's great. Thank you, Jen. So we have a few minutes left. And I see Sharon and Randy, you both have questions. And maybe we'll start with you, Sharon. And it'd be great if each of you could articulate your questions succinctly in a way that you ask the question and then Jan can then respond. So go ahead, Sharon.
I'll do my best. My question was, I was always taken with the title of the book, Black Baptist and Buddhist. And I wondered if the Baptist community, if you have engaged them presently, how do they respond to you? Because sometimes myself as a practitioner, it's not, I don't know what to say about it. It's not I don't want to say, but it's it's viewed very differently.
All right, Sharon, thank you.
Mm.
Could I tell a story to answer that?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, thank you. So I'm visiting home once, and not too long ago, but my father and mother are both alive then. And so I think my parents were proud to say, oh, daughter is a professor. You know, my mother said they pay her all this money. She only works 2 hours a week. That's how my mother saw it. You know, college profs, what do they do? Yeah. So, so they had clearly a different impression of what it was I actually did. But they were proud to say I taught. I was a professor. They weren't as proud to say I taught Buddhism, you know, because that wasn't, I'm teaching Christianity, you know. So, all right. So one day I'm having a book signing in Birmingham, and my father and my nephews, you know, some cousins come. And sure enough, in walks Reverend Porter, who is the minister at this big church that's sort of bougie. You know, it wasn't a church that my family and I were, and my father's was 2 years probationary. He asked us every Sunday dinner, you know, when I was home, well, I hope nobody minds if I think about moving to this other church. I'm sort of liking this preacher. 2 years. My father was the youngest deacon at our Baptist church, the one in Docena. But this church moved. It was in the city. And its minister was Reverend Porter, who was the assistant minister to Dr. King, but I didn't know that at the time. In walks Reverend Porter to this book signing. And I could see my father, who hadn't told him, and they were sort of good friends, you know, they respected each other. They could quote, you know, verse, chapter and verse. They talked about each other's ties, you know. Reverend Porter, that's a really fine one today. Well, Reverend Willis, that one's looking pretty good, you know. They talked about the ties, you know, because they could really talk about the verses. Okay. So, but my father looks like, uh-oh, he's going to see what it is I really write about, Reverend Porter. So he comes over, you know, I'm sitting at the table, all my cousins, everybody around. Reverend Porter comes over and he looks at the title of the book. It might have been Enlightened Beings here. And then he says, well, Brother Willis, I tell you, either the Lord or the Buddha sent me here today. And I said, phew. And my father was at ease for a little bit. Either the Lord or the Buddhas, plural. Reverend Porter, I love him, or the Buddha sent me in here today. And then Reverend Porter says, I'm going to come over. I'm going to take you on a tour of the town. He took me to lunch. He said, we could use more of this meditation thing in the church. It was sort of like Howard Thurman. We could use more of it. We could use it. That's what he told me. But, you know, in private at lunch, you know. He said, we could use that. And he says, tell me this, what mantra do you say? And I'm going, he knows mantra. He knows the term, you know. And I said, well, you know, like a common one is Om Mani Padme Hum, you know, it's to the Buddha of compassion. He said, well, I tell you what mine is. Oh, really? He said, mine is have mercy. That's what I say when I'm in deep trouble. I say, have mercy, Lord, have mercy. And perfect mantra, perfect. So then I met Reverend Porter, and Reverend Porter was all right with me. Then my dad was all right with me too. He was at ease, you know, no more worries about it. My mother's still a little worried. I see all these books you write. I don't see God anywhere in them. Then my father would try to interpret it for her. Well, Doc, when she says so-and-so, it's like, my mother, go on, man. I don't see him anywhere in here. But so my father was a great support. And it's not always comfortable. And it's certainly not theologically correct, right? People are going to, you know, unless, you know, you've been saved by the Lord, and you can call him your one and sole savior, then, And my response is, that's not the way I understand Jesus And I don't believe it's the way Jesus would have responded to me. And that's true. So like I like that Howard Thurman talked about the religion of Jesus, not the Christian religion with all its dogma and institutions, you know. It's about what's in our heart, you know. What's the greatest commandment? Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, and all thy mind, and all thy soul. And the second is like unto it. Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. It's difficult, isn't it? But that's what Buddhism says too. You need to love everyone. So I hope that helps, Sharon. Thank you for your question. It's great. Thank you.
Thank you, Jan. I imagine I'm not just speaking for myself when I say that I would be perfectly content to listen to you talk for another few hours and teach. And I am grateful to Randy. I mentioned to Randy that we don't really have time for questions, and Randy will reach out to you. Thank you, Randy, for being so understanding.
I'm
I
so
wanted-
sorry. I see. Now I see the time. I'm so sorry. I ran over.
We haven't run over yet, and there's a couple last things I want to say. One is that, as many of you know, at the Barry Center for Buddhist Studies, we do not have contracts with our teachers. We practice this tradition of dana, or generosity. Dana is related to our English term donation, but really it's a much larger idea. It's the first virtue practiced by the Bodhisattva in cultivating an awakened mind, because it at the same time alleviates the deepest needs of others and also allows us to relinquish things. And dana can be expressed in service and volunteering, in one's practice, in all kinds of ways. I am particularly moved by dana because in this hyper-capitalistic world that we live in, where everything is monetized, we're all entrepreneurs in a neoliberal world and gig workers, and here is a practice which is deeply countercultural, of teachers and institutions having trust in the community, and a community who has trust in the teachers, and people sharing in a way that is, yes, there's some reciprocity, but it's not really about a contractual exchange. And to me, that's very inspiring. And so the invitation here is never to give more than one's comfortable, but to support Jan, who has freely offered this event. There will be a link in the chat, and a link there's a dana link, and there's also a survey link. We have a survey after all of our programs, and we think of it as a form of dana, an expression of dana, to fill out the survey, which has some questions both about this evening, but also about other programs you might be interested in. And if you were willing to fill that out, we would be grateful. So with that, I want to express my deepest gratitude, Jan, for your generosity, for showing up tonight, and not just showing up tonight. When I made the comment about your book on Tibetan Buddhist meditation being written so long ago, it was really, that was early on in the taking up of Tibetan Buddhist practice in the United States. There are very few books on Tibetan meditation in the US that were published before that. And you have played an important role in the transmission of Buddhism, both, one can say, in a kind of traditional Tibetan context and your scholarly work, but also the way in which Dreaming Me in some way allows Buddhism to feel more native to life in the United States. And that is such a great gift of generosity that you have given all of us, and I am so grateful for that. So thank you. Okay, good night, everyone.
It has
Good
been
to
a
see-
great pleasure seeing you all. And thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. I enjoyed. Thank you so much. Keep well, please. Keep well. Keep healthy.
I'm going to take a risk here, Jan.
Who's that?
Eileen, Asha.
Hi, Asha.
I also went to the Zen Center one, but I was getting over COVID. I purposely didn't speak because I wanted to make sure people got to speak. You might very well not want to. I'm wondering if there's a way to contact you,
To contact me.
like an email or something. If not, that's fine.
Yes, you can contact me at J Willis
Okay.
at Agnes Scott. Make sure you have 2 S's.
Okay.
AGNESSCOTT.edu.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Thank you, William. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you again for your generosity, Jen. I saw several people writing down your email, and several people who chatted me were hoping to follow up with questions. So that
Just tell
again,
me
thank you for your
you were
generosity.
here at this meeting, this gathering, okay? If you want to follow up, that's fine. Thank you so much.
Okay, good night, everyone.
Good night. Keep healthy. Keep well.